St. John's College is the nation's great books college. Students explore 3,000 years of human thought in just 4 years, or 2 for graduate students. Encounter history's most influential works, where students engage in group discussions about the fundamental questions underlying human society. Learn more about St. John's undergraduate and graduate programs in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Annapolis, Maryland, including online options at sjc.edu.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
According to Our World in Data, in 1800, not a single region of the world had a life expectancy longer than 40 years. By 2021, the global average life expectancy was more than 70 years. It's still not enough. We want to live longer, healthier lives. What can we do about it? You've probably heard of blue zones, regions of the world where researchers claim to have found disproportionate numbers of people living into their hundreds. The first such Eden was Sardinia, Italy, then Okinawa, Japan, and Loma Linda, California, among others. But in recent years, despite the prevalence of cookbooks and diets and Netflix docuseries about these places explaining how to learn from the lifestyles of people living in these regions, something hasn't quite added up. My name's Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic, and this is Good on Paper, a policy show that questions what we really know about popular narratives. Saul Newman is a longevity researcher at the University of Oxford and the University College London who has become convinced that this research doesn't stand up to scrutiny. First, when he looks at the regions of the world designated blue zones, they just don't look like particularly healthy places. The blue zones theory claims that people live longer in these regions because of their naturally healthy lifestyles. But what Saul finds when he looks at these regions is low literacy, low incomes, high crime, and even short life expectancies relative to the national average. But even more tellingly, according to his research, introducing official birth certificates suspiciously coincides with a steep 69 to 82% fall in the number of people claiming to be over 109. A number of other statistical oddities indicate that the people claiming to be over 100 years old are either misleading us or are misled themselves. Here at Good on Paper, several of the studies we discuss are preprints, which means they haven't finished going through the formal review process that can take years. We do this because waiting to discuss studies until after they've been through that process would mean missing out on tracking important live debates. But I say all that now because while Saul is convinced of his findings, this is not yet a settled debate. The proponents of blue zones are fighting back and claim he omits or misunderstands how rigorous their methods are. But to hear his perspective on the science of longevity and why he doesn't trust the blue zones research, I'm excited to have Saul joining us today. Saul, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So, why do people die?
Why do people die? Well, this is a fascinating question. And many of the people in aging research sort of still admit that we really don't understand the fundamentals. So it's actually a surprising thing that something so obvious is something we're still figuring out. The best approximation we have at the moment is that we look at the inverse question of why continue to live? What is the sort of evolutionary advantage of continuing to live? There are two main thoughts. One I favor and another that's quite out of date. The out-of-date one is this sort of Darwinian idea that we exist just to make children. And this is the idea that has the problems. Because if we exist just to make children, you get stuck with all sorts of awkward questions like, why does menopause evolve? Like, why evolve not to have children? Why evolve to help other people at the cost of your own reproduction? And we know all these things happen, and they happen across the animal kingdom. Which brings us to the second idea. And the second idea is that we evolved to pass on genes, and because we are related to so many different people, there are a lot of ways to pass on genes, and including indirect ways where we help others. This is a sort of still developing field in answering that question of why we exist, essentially. And it's a very exciting one because it can explain things like the evolution of menopause, where we're taking care of grandchildren. But it can also potentially explain a lot of traits that are very difficult to analyze. It's just sort of traits like homosexuality don't make sense in this sort of cruel, hard Darwinian sense of, you're just a baby factory. But there is a potential to explain them using inclusive fitness. I mean, that said, there is also the flip side argument to that why do I need to justify myself in terms of evolutionary theory in order to exist? Well, of course you don't. So it's a very difficult debate to get through, but it's also an open question at this point.
What exactly is happening, though, when you die, right? Like, what is, like, if, let's say you don't get an illness, right? Like, we know what happens when someone dies of a stroke or has a heart attack or has cancer or some other kind of long-running illness. But if you are just a generally healthy person, you're in your 80s, you're in your 90s, what's happening to your body?
It's slowly degenerating in functional terms. So this is often very hard to measure because you have to define what the function of your body is to say how it's degenerating. But there are sort of obvious signs. So your metabolic function declines with age. Obvious things like your physical capacity to do run 100 meters, for example, declines with age. Mental capacity does decline, but it can be much slower. And I think that's really fascinating because if you look at, for example, the rankings of top chess players, they decline, but they decline extremely slowly. But essentially there's this sort of general systemic decline as you get older in terms of how well you can function.
There's a paper that I know that you wrote about these. There's an idea of, as you get older, of course, your likelihood of death increases as you age. But there was a hypothesis that perhaps at a certain point, the rate at which you were likely to die kind of leveled off. So
yes.
If you made it to 80, if you made it to 90, yes, your likelihood of dying every year was still, elevated relative to a younger person, but it no longer was increasing significantly. What happened with that hypothesis?
Well, this touches on the best way we have to measure age and aging, and that sort of functional decline is increases in the mortality rate, because once you hit about age 40 or 35, your odds of dying double at a sort of fixed clockwork rate. So
wait, what year was that?
Around 35 to 40. It depends a little bit because
great.
There's
just logging that.
yeah. No, there's it starts to decline earlier, but it's obscured by something called the accident hump. And this is basically like what you do when you're a teenager, right? There's a big bump in mortality caused by, hitting cars running into trees or jumping off of buildings into swimming pools or whatever it happens to be. But this clockwork doubling means that your odds of dying double. It's usually around every 8 years. And there's really nothing we can do about that. We can change the baseline, but every 8 years, your odds of dying will double and double and double and double until you reach old age. And so in old age, there's a hypothesis that mortality rates stop getting worse with age and therefore that aging rates kind of stop or at least slow down considerably. Now, it doesn't mean that things are getting better. You end up in this sort of Russian roulette scenario where it's as if your odds of dying flatten out and essentially you're playing Russian roulette every 3 months in terms of your mortality risk. Now, what does that mean in terms of human lifespan? So it means something very interesting. It means that there's no actual limit to how long you can play roulette without losing. There's a probabilistic sort of cap where eventually you are going to lose.
Yeah. Unless you're the luckiest person alive.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's nothing per se ruling out a run of good numbers. But the problem here is that this idea is something that's been fought over for 50-odd years and has not been resolved, because it may be that your odds of dying do keep doubling and doubling and doubling until they hit the odds of dying that equal to 1, right? So this is what I called the maximum survivable age. And it's not clear to scientists which of those two was correct, whether we strike a maximum survivable age where we can't possibly live older than this age, or whether we reach this sort of grim Russian roulette scenario.
But life expectancy has improved remarkably over the 20th century. I mean, we're seeing, people at average lifespans of late 70s in many developed nations, and rates of child mortality have declined significantly. So it seems like there's a lot that policy, development, changes in public health strategies can do to improve lifespan. Is it your sense that, you just kind of brought up this idea of a maximum survivable age, is it your perception that there just there is a number, there is a threshold at which, despite all of these things that you can do to make yourself healthier, to make yourself better, the, genetic selection that might exist over generations, there's just not a chance that humans are going to live to be, 300, 400, et cetera?
Well, in 2016, I waded into this debate because, like I said, there are two sides. And one of the sides had published an idea that there was this hard limit to maximum lifespan, and they published it in one of the most elite scientific journals there is. And I realized it made colossal mistakes in their analysis, really just fundamental mistakes. They had rounded off most of their data to 0. They had accidentally deleted everyone who died in May and June and just really made a complete mess of it. But they had argued for one case. And this case was that there's a limit to how long you can live, a single limit. I had another group come along and argue the opposite. Now, the opposite was this Russian roulette scenario. The problem was that they had done something even worse, because they had taken everybody in Italy aged over the age of 105 and used them to build this sort of flattening out curve. And when they had made this curve, they needed to say what it was flattening out from. So they needed to say, well, what's the normal midlife probability of death and how fast does it get worse? What it boiled down to is that they had picked out the only estimate from earlier life mortality models that gave them a flattening out result. So they had 861 options, and they chose the only option that gave them a significant result. So here I was in the middle of a very vitriolic and long-running debate saying that both camps were wrong. And I think both camps are wrong. Because if you take that maximum survivable age and you estimate it, it doesn't converge to a single value mathematically. And so in plain language, what that means is that if you grow up in a different environment, your maximum survivable age is different. And it moves over time, really clearly moves over time. So there is not one limit to human life. There is, at best, a smorgasbord of limits that depend on where you grew up, what population you're in.
So essentially, there is a maximum survivable age, but it will differ based on the environmental and policy choices that are being made at that time. And so I guess that then the question just becomes how much can you really do on environmental factors? So I want to get to this question about this theory of blue zones, which I think has become very popular. I mean, there's been a popular book, a Netflix docuseries that's inspired tons of attention. There are regions of the world where people have claimed to live remarkably long lives, past 80, even past 100, at rates higher than you would expect just based on if it was just distributed normally. Places like Okinawa in Japan, Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece. What was originally the evidence for the idea that these places were unusually good for long life?
Well, the original evidence was rather amusing, actually, because like everything else in extreme age research, there's only one data source for human ages, and that's documents. You have government documents or informal documents to say, I am this old. But the amusing factor was that the first Blue Zones study found a bunch of people within Sardinia that seemed to be living a long time. They didn't measure anyone outside of Sardinia. They decided that this was a global outlier for extraordinary ages and thought that incest, that people sleeping with each other, was making this island.
I've never heard of this.
It's extraordinary. It doesn't make it to the
Netflix
documentary
docuseries?
for a very good reason. Yeah, I mean, there's nobody making this lifestyle recommendation, right? I hope. It's
Dear
kind
God.
of it's kind of amazing, and that was the start of the Blue Zones. So I sort of vaguely knew about this idea while I was getting involved in this fight between the plateau people and the people who think there's a limit to human life. And, I sort of thought of it as an amusing aside. But as time went on, it became less and less amusing, more and more concerning, like starkly concerning. And the reason is that everything in these studies is based off looking at documents and saying, oh, they're consistent.
You mean like birth certificates?
I mean birth certificates. Yeah. So there are a lot of problems with that really came out of the woodwork over time because it's on paper. But when I started looking into these extreme age cases, it really snowballed. Everything snowballed in a way that completely destroyed the idea and the underlying data of the Blue Zones. And effectively, people are just believing their own fairy tales here. And this really, goes beyond cases, though, because early on in the investigation, I discovered that Japan, where it was claimed Japan had among the world's best evidence for birth records. And in 2010, it turned out that 82% of the people over the age of 100 in the country were dead.
And was it pension fraud or what?
It was not pension fraud. It was the remarkable fact that in Japan, the household has to register your death. And if you're the last person in the household and you're dead, how do you do that?
Oh, wow.
So they had literally hundreds of thousands of people who had died in World War II or had died subsequently and who were just getting older on paper, including the oldest man in Tokyo and the oldest woman in Tokyo.
Were they paying them Social Security?
Yes.
What was happening? Where was the money going?
Well, in the case of the oldest man in Tokyo, the money was going to the family, and he was an extraordinary case that kicked off this investigation because so there's a sort of week in Japan where there's a respect for the aged week, and in preparation, city officials in Tokyo had gone looking for the oldest man, and eventually they found out that the oldest man was in Tokyo, but he'd been dead in his apartment for 30 years, and his family were living in the apartment. And the oldest man in Tokyo had been steadily collecting his pension checks. Now, what's extraordinary about that is that his paperwork was perfectly in order. If you handed their paperwork to a demographer, they would not be able to see anything wrong with it. I mean, it's not like you die and automatically a form pops out in the central bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
There's no actual way to know. So it turned out that most extreme old age data was undetected errors. And this happened in every Blue Zone.
So you went through all the Blue Zones and saw the same
went through all
pattern.
the Blue Zones, and the same thing happened. In Greece, at least 72% of the people in Greece who were over age 100 were collecting their pension checks from underground. And what's remarkable about that is they had just passed a government audit, despite being dead. They passed a government audit in 2011, and in 2012, the government turned around and said, actually, all those people were dead.
So walk me through this a little bit, because I think there's a few different arguments that you're making here.
Sure.
One is that there are places where it's quite difficult to just know what's happening with the population because there's like what you mentioned with Japan, where their reporting of death is happening in a method where you actually can't validate when the oldest person in a household has died. And then there's a second strand of things, which is that people are actively committing fraud because of pensions and Social Security or other sorts of welfare benefits. And then there's a third, which is just that these documents are not consistent or good. And so when demographers are trying to do this kind of research, they're ending up having to rely on pretty shoddy documentation in order to make broad claims. So how much of this is happening in each place? What do you think is most prevalent?
We don't know what's most prevalent. I mean, this is actually part of the problem that we can see when an error has happened, but if we have documents in front of us that look good, we don't know if they're an error or not. And this, is pattern repeats itself. So there are many, many ways. There's a whole layer cake of different methods by which you can screw up someone's age. Like you said, you can just write it down wrong at the start. There was a case where the world's oldest man was actually just his younger brother, and they just swapped documents. It's completely undetectable, and it's happened 3 times. And there are other cases where there's active pension fraud. I mean, there's also cases where you just have someone who is illiterate and has picked up the wrong documents. The list goes on and on and on. But the point is that demographers keep validating these people, and then decades, or even in one case a century later, find out that they aren't who they say they are. Mm-hmm. And that process is pretty much random. So you have to ask yourself, what happens to a field over the course of more than a century when the data can only be checked for being consistent? You can't actually tell if it's true. Mm-hmm. And I think it really set up this extraordinary disaster where not only are the blue zones based on data that doesn't make sense, we actually have this sort of fundamental problem in looking at the oldest people within our society. Blue zones are an exemplary case of this, but it's more general. Mm-hmm. So to give you an example, like health in the blue zones was poor before, during, and after they were established. Even in America, at least 17% of people over the age of 100 were clerical errors, missing or dead. At least 17%. Many of them just did not have birth certificates, mm-hmm. and we have no way of knowing. Like, it's not as if I can take a person into a hospital and they can put them into a machine and it tells me how old they are. Right?
You cut their arm off and count the rings on the tree.
Exactly. Yeah. The old pirate joke, right? Yeah. You cut the leg off and count the rings. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And that means we are just taking all of this evidence at face value. Normally that would be fine, right? And this is where I apologize for talking numbers. No. But this is a theoretical result I came up with in 2018. And let's imagine you have 100,000 people who are 50, really 50, like they've got their documents, everything. And then you have an extraordinarily low rate of error in which you take 100 40-year-olds and you give them documents to say they're 50. If you do that, normally you'd expect, I can just ignore this, my statistical model will take care of it as noise. But something happens instead that is extraordinary, because those 40-year-olds are, like I said, less than half as likely to die than the real data. So your errors have a lower rate of dying and being removed from the population than your real data.
Wait, sorry, can you explain that? I don't understand.
So you remember I told you about the clock where your mortality rate doubles every 8 years. That means if, let's say I call them young liars. If my young liars are 8 years younger, their odds of dying day to day are half. Mm-hmm. So the errors have half the mortality rate of the real data.
Okay.
Every 8 years, the percentage of errors doubles. And by the time you get to 100, every single person, or almost every single person, is an error. So you can't ignore these tiny error rates. It doesn't matter what country you're in. It doesn't matter where you are. You can't just pretend they don't exist, because they build up in this weird, non-linear way over time. And it means that you would actually mathematically expect all of the oldest people in the world to be fake. So, I've published this in a scientific journal. No one's ever been able to argue the math, but they do not want to face up to sort of the repercussions of this.
Yeah. Part of this is very, very familiar to me. I don't have a birth certificate. I was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and the only document I have about my birth and parentage is a baptismal certificate where I'm pretty sure it was filled out by a member of the church that I was baptized into, and then I have to present. It's I'm not joking. It's written in teal ink.
Yeah.
And I'm taking this. We were asylum seekers here. I'm taking this to the State Department. I'm I swear to God, my father is my father. You literally have to give me a passport. I'm a citizen here. And it was awful. It was such a hassle. And now I'm getting off topic here, but my brother had to get a DNA test to prove that our parents were his parents in order to get his driver's license eventually and his passport. It was anyway. So I'm very familiar with this. And there's another phenomenon which I don't know if this is something that you've seen in your research. Where in some cultures and communities, of course, being older is like quite an advantage culturally. And so there'll be people who you're like, I know how old you are, but you are telling everyone you are 10 to 15 years older than you are. Have you seen this in your research?
All the time. I mean, constantly. There's a study in the BBC a couple of months ago where they looked at heart aging, and this is an NIH-funded, National Institute of Aging funded study on people in sort of the rainforest, right? And they say, we don't have any idea how old we are. And the headline is, oh, these people have really young hearts for their age. They don't know their age. They're literally telling you, we're making it up. And, if you have any doubts about the blue zones, there used to be something called the longevity zones that predates the blue zones. It was put out by the National Geographic in exactly the same way. It would have exactly the same hallmarks of, oh, you live in a mountainous region that's very remote and you eat yogurt and vegetarian diets. And it was just exactly what you're saying. These people gave status to village elders, so people were inflating their ages to an extraordinary degree. They were saying, I'm 122, and that's all it was. Mm-hmm. This was 3 regions across the world: Soviet Georgia, right, where apparently yogurt was the secret, the Vilcabamba Valley, the place called Vilcabamba in Ecuador, and the Hunza Valley in Pakistan. Right? And these were the blue zones, and every single case was based on rubbish record keeping. And, it just seems to be that that's exactly what's happened again.
After the break, even if blue zones aren't real, does that really change how we think about living longer?
St. John's College is for students who seek meaning in their lives, who ask hard questions of themselves and their world, and who dare to free their minds. In vigorous, discussion-based classes, students grapple with fundamental ideas by engaging with works by some of the world's greatest writers and thinkers. From Homer, Plato, Seneca, and Euclid, to Nietzsche, Einstein, Woolf, and Baldwin. St. John's program of study includes over 200 great books from across 3,000 years of history, including philosophy, literature, politics, math, science, and music. At St. John's, faculty are known as tutors and not professors. This is because they will never profess to know anything. Rather than telling you what to think, they will help you ask great questions. Questions like, how can human flourishing be maximized? What kinds of leaders do we want and need? Can personal peace exist when social chaos reigns? At St. John's, you will learn to listen deeply and across perspectives, to speak and reason with precision, and to honor the value that each student brings to the conversation. St. John's graduates, who are systems thinkers in a world of specialists, go on to become writers, judges, diplomats, lawyers, school leaders, ethicists, linguists, scientists, researchers, and more. Explore 3,000 years of human thought in just 4 years, or 2 for graduate students, on St. John's 2 campuses in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland. Learn about our robust financial aid and our academic programs at sjc.edu. That's sjc.edu.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-8444-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
The thing I'm wrestling with when I engage with this, because you have published this work, you've written about it in the Times and other places, but the fundamental idea that there are locations that are better for people's lifespans seems not overturned by this, right? Like, we know that location matters a lot for health outcomes, air pollution in particular. It feels like there's a new paper every other week showing that there's massive impacts of air pollution on life expectancy, on cognitive functioning, on general health. Is the fundamental concept that there are certain places where people are going to live longer still one that we should be putting more research into?
I think that's not controversial, but I also think it's very well understood for exactly the reasons you say. There's a study every week on average life expectancy, right? And what's striking about this is that those places are very different from the places that get extreme life expectancy. So I basically took a sample of 80% of the world's 110-year-olds and most of the world's 105-year-olds and looked at their distribution within countries. So I'm sitting in London right now, and in all of England, the place with the best rate of reaching 105 was the single poorest inner city suburb with the single fewest number of 90-year-olds. So those two things, where it's good to live on average and where it's good to reach extreme old age, were exactly the opposite. This is like saying Flint, Michigan is the healthiest place in the USA. No shade on Flint, Michigan, right? The government is really the cause of this. But it does not make any sense. It fundamentally doesn't make any sense. And it gets even worse when you start looking at the detail. So the single US blue zone is Loma Linda. I mean, the CDC measure Loma Linda for lifespan. They measure it, and it is completely and utterly unremarkable.
Why do you think, I mean, I don't know, like I'm not, deeply reporting in the longevity space here, but the way that you have talked about your interactions with some of these authors makes me think it's an especially contentious field. Why has it kind of remained so difficult to sort of overturn this popular narrative around blue zones?
Well, it makes a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's really that simple. I mean, there are multiple best-selling cookbooks, and I'd like to point out, of course, that don't take your health advice from cookbooks.
Yeah.
Right? It's really sort of needs reinforcing every now and again. But, if you really had a cure for aging, right, you'd be winning the Nobel Prize.
You wouldn't be writing a cookbook?
You would not be writing a cookbook. You wouldn't be on late-night television, making a sales pitch. Yeah. You'd just be like, I want my Nobel Prize. I have a cure for all diseases. Where's my money, right?
Yeah,
It's really fundamental. But there is another aspect to this, in that a lot of research careers are built on examining the oldest old, and even more research careers are built on just assuming that birth certificate ages are correct. And to show that they're not correct in an undetectable fashion on such a massive scale threatens a lot of people's research careers.
But part of the thing that I find interesting about the Blue Zone's recommendations, right, is that a lot of them are things that are just straightforwardly good advice, right? Move naturally, have a sense of purpose, stress less, don't eat too much, eat beans and legumes, have community, put your family first. The only one that I think is potentially not actually good is drink alcohol in moderation. But the rest of them are generally associated with good health to different extents. And, with longevity to different extents. I guess, what drove you to become so interested in pushing back on this narrative, given that the advice that people are getting is generally still, good health advice? You probably should do most of these things if you're not already.
Well, I think the problem is the way in which the people in these regions are really kind of culturally being exploited. Because they don't bear any connection to what actually happens in the blue zones. And I think that was what really drove it home for me, is that you have this sort of flavor of some guy turns up for a few weeks, looks around, decides it's the ikigai, and goes home. And if you actually go to the government of Japan, they've been measuring Okinawa, for example, since 1975. And every single time they've measured Okinawa, it has had terrible health. It has been right at the bottom of the pile.
Wow.
It's I'll take you through some statistics that are
Please,
sort of robustly ignored by people in selling these blue zones ideas. Body mass index is measured in Okinawa and compared to the rest of Japan, and it's measured in over 75s, right? So if you go back to 1975, that's people born 1900 or before, and they measure how heavy they are. They have been last every year by a massive margin.
Wow.
Right? And then you look at the next claim. So that sort of knocks a hole in the move naturally claim. The move naturally claim also has this sort of idea that people grow gardens in the blue zones, right? The government of Japan measures that, and they are third last out of 47 prefectures after Tokyo and Osaka, where everyone lives in a high-rise. They don't grow gardens. And we've known that since the beginning of records. And then you look at the idea that they eat plants, right? This seems really non-controversial, but people in Okinawa do not eat their veggies. It's really, and we know this because we ask them. They're last in the consumption of root vegetables, last in the consumption of leafy vegetables, last in the consumption of pickled vegetables, right? They're third from the top in other raw meat. You know, they eat 40 kilograms of meat a year at least, which is way above the global and national average. And even sweet potato, right? Sweet potato is on the front of the Netflix documentary, these purple sweet potatoes. They are last for sweet potato consumption out of all the 47 prefectures of Japan.
Wow. Okay.
Right? And they always have been. There's another idea that, you know, they have a sense of belonging. They belong to a faith-based community. They are 93.4% atheist.
Wow.
They are third last in the country, and it is a very atheist country. So the problem is that none of these claims have any connection to reality whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it's been sitting in the open for decades.
Have you become a lot more cynical about scientific research as a result of this?
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary, the sort of cognitive dissonance that goes on. And really, I mean, all of these claims just have no connection to reality. And you see this sort of sad thing playing out with the locals where a beach resort will get built, people fly in for 3 days, and they're still sitting there going, like, why don't we have a hospital? Why are we all still poor? Why, just basic social problems get overlooked because of this. So, yeah, it has made me much more cynical because these I guess you would call them lumps and bumps, should have been obvious right from the point when someone said incest was good for living a long time.
Yeah. So, pre-registration helps reduce a lot of issues in social science. There's also been increasing attempts to subject, big findings, important findings to replication by various groups and individuals. I mean, is there something fundamental that you think needs to happen differently in terms of how reputable journals accept new findings? Do you think that all the data needs to be open? Like, what needs to happen here to prevent these sorts of problems in the future?
In short, answer is really a lot.
Yeah.
The slightly less short answer is that the core of science is reproducibility. That is the core idea. And these results are not reproducible. And it's not just that they're not reproducible. After 20 years, nobody has published the underlying data. And there needs to be a much heavier emphasis on replication in science and on testing claims, especially profitable claims, before they're just thrown out into the open. Because, I find it amazing. This is something that was discussed at an elite level at the World Economic Forum. Now, we cannot have a cookbook-based piece of lifestyle advice, governing global health.
Yeah.
So we need to really rejig first, the level of skepticism in science needs to go up considerably. And second, we need to really start hitting back on papers that need to be retracted, papers that need to be removed from the scientific record because they do not replicate or because they've, like the first two, the studies I pointed out here, because they're based on extremely questionable choices.
So, you've mentioned, obviously it's most people listening to this will have heard of this topic before, but have you found anything that indicates it's been especially influential in public health, in that policymakers are taking it quite seriously as a way of trying to push different non-validated recommendations?
Yes, the presentation at the World Economic Forum is really a low point. an extraordinary low point. But I think what is, like I said, more troubling is that you have an entire machinery of public health here that didn't spot how completely wrong this is. It's in retrospect, it's so wrong that everybody's sort of giggling. But it's been 20 years of this being perhaps the most popular idea in demography. And so I get worried about this because I've just completed a new study. And in this new study, I've taken every single 100-year-old in the world and analysed where they're from and what countries attain the age of 100 at the highest rates. And to do this, I took United Nations data contributed by every government on earth in good faith with the best efforts at data cleaning, both by the governments and by the UN. And the places that reach 100 at the most remarkable rates don't make any sense. Malawi, which is one of the 10 poorest countries on the earth, is in the top 10. And it's in the top 10 routinely. Western Sahara, which is a region that does not have a government, is one of the best places in the world for reaching 100 according to the UN. I mean, that's fundamentally absurd. And it's fundamentally absurd that it's been 70 years that this data has been produced for and nobody has noticed the absurdity. And I find that deeply shocking. Puerto Rico was one of the top 10, and that initially that passes muster, right? You've got a place in a rich country that has a long history of birth certificates, until you realise that this is one of the best places in the world for reaching 100, and the reason seems to be that the birth certificates are so badly documented that they restarted the entire system in 2010. They said birth certificates are no longer legal documents.
Okay.
Threw it all out and started again because of systemic levels of error.
Wow.
And that's the best. That's how you reach 100. You just write your age down wrong. There is this sort of public health element that is deeply troubling because you're one of the people in the world that doesn't have a birth certificate, and you're not alone. Yeah. A quarter of children now don't have a birth certificate. A quarter of all children.
Yeah.
And we're just ignoring that.
I want to take a step back because I think that even though I think this is deeply troubling, there is still a desire. I mean, part of the reason why there's such a focus on this issue is people really want to figure out how to extend their life. That every year they get older, they're deeply concerned with yoga, with protein intake, with lifting weights, a lot of different things that begin to occupy your mind as you the number turns to 3, 4, 5 at the beginning of your age. I want to ask about how much we know about the role of environmental versus genetic factors in determining longevity. Is all of this effort to try and tweak our life expectancy, is it really that worth it, or is it largely just a question of your genetics kind of determine what your life expectancy is going to be?
I mean, there's good news and bad news.
Yeah.
And I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is, well, it depends on your perspective, I suppose. The bad news is that the people who live the longest on average are born into rich countries with free healthcare. It's that simple. The good news is when it comes to the environment, it plays a big role, very big role in how long you live. And there is a lot you can do about it. Not a single one of which costs any money. Right? So I'll break it down. The simple things that we really know about lifespan. Don't drink. That you'll get, it depends, but if you were going to get addicted, you'll get about an extra 30 years of lifespan over what you would if you got addicted to alcohol. But if you, for context, the CDC estimate that that's about the same as heroin addiction. But if you drink without getting addicted and give up drinking, you're still going to gain roughly 3 to 4 years.
Wow, okay.
Right? So that's simple.
Yeah.
Don't smoke. You'll gain about 7 years. Do some exercise. You'll probably get, it depends how much you exercise, but let's say 4 years. Right? And go to your GP. And that's it. You don't need to buy the cookbook. Right? You can just, I think the reason the cookbook sells so well is that those 3 things are somewhat difficult. Right? They're kind of hard. And I think this is why longevity cures perennially do so well, is that they're always easier than those 3 things, almost always, the ones that do well. And that is what underpins this market. But if you really want to live a longer time, just don't drink, don't smoke, do some exercise.
Well, tell me a little bit more about the genetic factors here. I mean, there was a study I saw about that looked at 20,000 Nordic twins born in the late 1800s and found that genetic differences had negligible impacts on survival before about age 60. But after age 60, and particularly those reaching their 80s and beyond, genetic factors become more important. Is that something, I don't know if you've seen that paper or if you've seen other research about this, but what do we know about the role of genetics in longevity?
I haven't seen that paper, but I've seen some extraordinarily bad papers on the roles of genetics in longevity. There's just something called a genome-wide association study where you effectively say, what genes are associated with extreme longevity. And I've seen that conducted on sample sizes of less than 200 people, which is, it's a bit like saying you've got a space program when you let go of a carnival balloon, right? It's a joke. So I would be extremely skeptical of longevity claims. There's just this fundamental problem with our documents that if you go into that study and dive into that study, you'll realize that they, like everybody else, has to trust what is written down on the piece of paper that says how old these people are. And there's no way to check that. I think we're on the edge of a situation where you can. There has been some extraordinary scientific advances in estimating people's age. But nobody seems to want to face up to that fundamental problem yet.
Well, Saul, this has been fantastic. Always our last and final question. What is something that you thought was a good idea but ended up being just good on paper?
I'll tell you something that turned out being bad on paper in the moment because when I was an undergrad, I'd been told to go to it's kind of like someone said to me, go to the best UK university. It's the one in Oxford, Oxford Brookes, which is not the University of Oxford. They told me completely the wrong university to go to, and I'd gone to it. Okay. So to sort of crawl my way out of this hole, I had found out that my university offered an exchange program to the Ivy League. And it was the first year they'd run it, so they just didn't understand how much it was going to cost. Okay. And I was like, great, I can be the poorest kid in the Ivy League. Right. So I went on exchange, but without me knowing it, they realized how much it cost and pulled my visa status after the first 6 months. So
my God.
Yeah, I wound up in the FBI building in LA, in a locked elevator going to one of the rooms for an interview. Oh my gosh. Just completely not knowing that I'd overstayed.
I don't even know. Is that even a good on paper? That just sounds like you got screwed.
It's as close as I got. I mean, it was good on paper right up until that point.
Yeah. What school were you going to?
I was going to Ithaca. Sorry, going to Cornell in Ithaca.
Cornell. Okay.
And paying, I think, $1,000 a semester in student loans. Yeah.
That's like one of those things where you really got to check to see if that deal's going to pan out.
I think it worked out in the long term, but short term, not so great.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
If you like what you heard on today's episode, I have a suggestion for you. My colleagues here at The Atlantic are exploring how we talk about aging in our newest How-To series. You can hear the trailer at the end of this episode and then go subscribe to How to Age Up, coming April 7th, wherever you listen to podcasts. Good on Paper is produced by Rosie Hughes. It was edited by Dave Shaw, fact-checked by Enna Alvarado, and engineered by Erica Huang. Our theme music is composed by Rob Smirsiak. Claudia Nabade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio. Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Jerusalem Dempsis, and we'll see you next week.
Do you think of yourself as grown up?
In terms of the responsibilities I have, yes, because I go to bed early because I know I have to get up at 5 to take care of my kid. But there are environments in which this switch goes off in my brain when the Brat album came out last year. I listened to it before going out one night, and it just shut something off in my brain, and I was like, I'm in my 20s again.
Yeah, Brat can do that.
I'm Yasmin Tayag, a staff writer with The Atlantic.
And I'm Natalie Brennan, producer at The Atlantic. We've been thinking a lot about aging and how it's different today than it was in the past.
In the early 1800s, knowing somebody's specific age would be today like somehow randomly knowing your neighbor's blood type. It just wasn't a thing. But today, everybody's become so age obsessed.
What's really going on here in this pursuit for longevity?
It's about this optimization, and it causes people to be less supportive of public health interventions because it really is about you. The responsibility is on you. And if you're not doing it, you're failing.
This season, we'll be talking to people who are resetting our assumptions about aging.
I'm here to tell you that your mother and your grandmother are pretty much having a good time.
And working to build new communities across generations.
They actually created a built community around foster families and older adults who are retired. Grandmas and grandpas all around that chose to be in this neighborhood. That's the dream.
Aging doesn't have to feel like a game with constantly changing rules.
A few years ago, everything was plant-based. It just seemed so clear Mediterranean diet is the way to go. And now I'm being served content all the time that's like, you need 8 billion grams of protein before you even drink your coffee in the morning. Is big protein just behind this?
I think it's a good rule that if the new advice is something you have to buy more of, be wary. And if the advice is always changing back and forth, be wary.
Listen to How to Age Up.
The first episode arrives Monday, April 7th. Subscribe now.
St. John's College is for students who seek meaning in their lives, who ask hard questions of themselves and their world, and who dare to free their minds. In vigorous, discussion-based classes, students grapple with fundamental ideas by engaging with works by some of the world's greatest writers and thinkers. From Homer, Plato, Seneca, and Euclid, to Nietzsche, Einstein, Woolf, and Baldwin. St. John's program of study includes over 200 great books from across 3,000 years of history, including philosophy, literature, politics, math, science, and music. At St. John's, faculty are known as tutors and not professors. This is because they will never profess to know anything. Rather than telling you what to think, they will help you ask great questions. Questions like, how can human flourishing be maximized? What kinds of leaders do we want and need? Can personal peace exist when social chaos reigns? At St. John's, you will learn to listen deeply and across perspectives, to speak and reason with precision, and to honor the value that each student brings to the conversation. St. John's graduates, who are systems thinkers in a world of specialists, go on to become writers, judges, diplomats, lawyers, school leaders, ethicists, linguists, scientists, researchers, and more. Explore 3,000 years of human thought in just 4 years, or 2 for graduate students, on St. John's 2 campuses in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland. Learn about our robust financial aid and our academic programs at sjc.edu. That's sjc.edu.